When we talk about a psychological evaluation for Texas, or we talk about a psychological evaluation for California, we're talking about a medical evaluation. If you do a bifurcated model, and we're going to talk about bifurcation in a bit, if you do a bifurcated model, the pre-offer portion is not considered the psychological evaluation. It may be an element of it, but it is not the psychological evaluation. The psychological evaluation is, by definition, medical and post-offer. All right, so California's regulations that we're talking about are applicable to the post-offer medical evaluation. Must be a California psychologist, California licensed psychologist or psychiatrist, minimum 5 years experience, 3 years postdoctoral, be familiar with the research literature on pre-employment psychological screening of peace officers and with relevant state and federal fair employment statutes, conduct the examination on behalf of and for the benefit of the employee department. Now, hey, I thought I fired you. That's right, we'll just leave right there. Thank you, I appreciate it. This piece here, be familiar with the research literature. How do you think that's going to be evaluated in California? Well, ultimately, yes. It becomes relevant when there's a complaint or when there's a adjudication of some kind.
Well, isn't some of this what we're doing to satisfy that requirement?
Exactly.
We go to appropriate training.
Exactly. So one of the things you want to do is maintain continuing education that's specialty relevant. And the other is, and here's my plug for board certification. Become board certified in police and public safety psychology through the American Board of Professional Psychology. And if you're unfamiliar with it, during a break, I'll be happy to talk to you about it. Or go to http://abppsp.org. If you come from a state that doesn't detail your procedures, just tells you the broad statutory requirement, then it's a good idea to use an informed process. And Oregon, for example, doesn't have any procedural requirements. The procedural requirements in Washington are very anemic. But California's process is fairly detailed, covers a lot of contingencies. So you can adopt it as a standard of practice by a large, in my case, contiguous state, but it's a very large state that's been doing psychological screening for a long time. It's the same with the criteria or the standards that we'll be talking about in a moment, the post-Big Ten standards, the criteria. If you don't have a state that defines what those criteria that you're looking for, rely upon the informed analysis of other jurisdictions. Okay, so they require that the evaluation be conducted post-conditional offer of employment. So by definition now, we're not talking about pre-offer screening. Do you think that this rule prohibits a bifurcated or pre-offer portions of the psychological? Absolutely not. In fact, California Post is very, very supportive of a bifurcated model. They've produced a document that I'll point to now. Called Pre-Offer Personality Testing in the Selection of Entry-Level California Peace Officers Resource Guide. Just go to post.gov and you'll get it. And I have a slide on this in a moment, so we'll hold off on that until we get to it. So it must be completed within 1 year. Yes, thank you. Unlike Texas, which was 180 days, it must be completed within 1 year prior to the date of employment. And the candidate, a candidate who's reappointed to the same department after any break in service must undergo a new psychological evaluation unless the previous evaluation occurred with one year from the date of reappointment. So there are, I'm not going to go over all of these standards, but it's important that you know what these procedural requirements are and that you're familiar with them. Again, if you don't have a protocol in your own state, then you may want to become informed about the protocols used in other states. If you have no requirement in your jurisdiction as to when the psychological evaluation must be done prior to appointment, you know Texas is 180, California is 365. You can lay out various options and point to different requirements in different jurisdictions and ask the agency, what do they want to use? So help them come to some determination. But it's very important that you know what the requirements are, and if there are no specified requirements by regulation, policy, or statute, that you work with your agency to define them. So let's talk about the psychological screening dimensions. They are based in California Post on the peace officer duties, powers, demands, and working conditions defined by the department. Now, what that implies is that although Post has minimum criteria that are laid on top of the statutory requirement. Remember, the statutory requirement is that you be free of any conditions which would impair your ability to perform the duties of the position. That's the statutory requirement. The regulatory requirement of assessing the post Big Ten dimensions, which we'll talk about shortly, is overlaid on top of that. So now your minimum qualifying criteria in the state of California for a peace officer position has grown from the statutory floor to now a regulatory floor. On top of that, Post says, talk to your agency. They may have some additional requirements that they want to impose. I can tell you that the criteria for a successful police officer in the Lake Oswego, Oregon Police Department, a very affluent, well-educated community where the average education is a master's degree, is very, very different than Portland, the Portland Police Bureau requirements, or Eastern Oregon. So talk to your individual agencies, find out what additional criteria. Now, you can't do that unless you first start with some corpus of criteria, some basic criteria. Again, we have no statutory requirement, and we have no regulatory requirement in Oregon, so I begin with the California Post dimensions. And I tell an agency, these are the criteria that I would use absent any guidance from you. Do you wish to supplement them, clarify, modify in any way these dimensions? Yes, Joe?
Actually, the state of California for state employees has a rule called 172, which has this large, encompassing, thorough, accurate, free from blah, 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 responsible kinds of things, which fits everybody in the state. That's used as the first criteria.
Okay.
Then there's 1031F, and then there's post.
Great.
So when disqualify somebody who does not meet the following requirements.
That's for state employees.
State employees.
Okay, so Joe's describing another layer that would be even foundational to 1031F, which is the statutory requirement in California.
For the some 45 peace officer definition of job description.
But you're not including municipal police officers. That's only for state employees, okay? Great. So that's important to be knowledgeable about those as well. They're likely to already be incorporated in some way into the 1031F, and so even if you weren't knowledgeable of them, you probably have them covered, I would guess, by 1031F.
As a practical matter, sometimes you really can't pin anything on 1031F or the Big Ten, but it does manage to fit the 172 requirement.
Good. So he's saying even if you couldn't fit it into the 1031F or the post Big Ten, it might pertain to this foundational regulatory standard for all state employees.
And the two major classes are state traffic officer and corrections.
Right. Okay. So let's go to the next one, Victoria. Thank you. Post also stipulates that this information shall be provided to the evaluator along with any other information that will allow the evaluator to make a psychological suitability determination. That is, what are the risk tolerances? And again, the post 10 dimensions are minimal criteria.